Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you, all of you, this is a great crowd, to this afternoon's event on the legacies of war and reconciliation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have a tremendous panel with us. You'll have a chance to meet them. And I wanted to mention up front that our discussion this afternoon coincides with something called the Prayer for Peace in Sarajevo, happening right now and being streamed live around the world. And in addition, this panel is being streamed live to them and around the world. So in a way, we're participating in this Prayer for Peace from abroad. You'll hear more about it from some of the speakers, but I will note that it is the largest interfaith gathering in the world that meets on a regular annual basis. We're delighted to have representatives from Sant'Egidio with us, including Claudio Betti and Andrea Bartoli, and delighted again to be part of this partnership, this collaboration about which you'll hear more in just a second. We're here, of course, to reflect on terrible events of some 20 years ago, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And for those of us old enough to remember, it's quite striking that 2 decades have passed since those terrible events. The images of violence and suffering are so vivid to so many of us. What we want to do today is have an opportunity to look back at the conflict in both its internal and external dimensions, but also to address, in a more hopeful mode, what has been unfolding since, without losing sight, of course, of continuing obstacles, what has been unfolding since, in particular ongoing efforts at coexistence, the promotion of understanding, and lasting peace in the region across religious, ethnic, and political lines. As I said at the outset, we have a distinguished panel to lead us through these themes. But before I introduce them and I take my seat with the panel here on stage, I'd like to take a second to introduce our president, Dr. John J. DeGioia, who will himself provide some words of welcome. As most of you in this room know, Dr. DeGioia served as the 48th president of Georgetown since 2001, and before that, for more than 2 decades, held a range of other leadership positions here at the university. Over the past 11 years under President DeGioia, Georgetown has emerged as a global force in higher education and as an innovator in efforts to link up our core mission of teaching and research with service to the wider world in the Catholic and Jesuit tradition. Examples include our campus in Doha, Qatar, our outreach to China, and our collaboration with the Archbishop of Canterbury's Muslim-Christian dialogue, Building Bridges. Dr. DeGioia has addressed broader issues in higher education as chair of the Board of Directors of Campus Compact, as a member of the Board of Directors for the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, and those are only 2 boards among very many. I want to finish by acknowledging President DeGioia's unflagging support of our efforts to advance the interdisciplinary study of religion and world affairs, our efforts to promote interreligious understanding here at Georgetown. Those efforts are very much alive within the Berkley Center and across our great university. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Jack DeGioia.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that introduction and for your dedication and leadership of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is making extraordinary contributions to the life of our community. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to welcome you here for today's dialogue. We're fortunate to have such an extraordinary panel of experts, each with a unique grounding in the scholarship and analysis of today's subject. We're also pleased to welcome Draga Vasiljevic, the second secretary to the ambassador of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we're grateful that you could join us here today. And we also gather as a community to discuss the conflict, as Tom mentioned, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which began 20 years ago. In the time since, our world community, our leaders and members of both our policy and academic communities, has dedicated deep scholarship and thought to the lessons that we can learn from our response to this conflict, as well as from the reconciliation and peace processes that followed. I wish to recognize two dear friends who are with us today on behalf of the community of Sant'Egidio. And one is Claudio Betti, who's here right in the front row, for the role that he's played in helping to build a thriving friendship and partnership between Georgetown and the community, as well as Dr. Andrea Bartoli, the representative of the community here in the United States, who will be speaking on the panel. He'll be introduced in more detail in a moment. But I'd like to share just a few brief thoughts about the context in which we hold today's dialogue. Our event here, as Tom mentioned, coincides with the annual gathering of Sant'Egidio's International Prayer for Peace, which is taking place in Sarajevo this year. For much of the 1990s, the people of Sarajevo were devastated by conflict and unimaginable violence, tragedies that defined their region for much of that decade. These events are not unfamiliar to our first-year students here at Georgetown, while these events took place prior to their birth. Each year we ask our incoming class to read a novel over the summer written by an international author, and when they arrive to campus, we bring the whole first-year student body together and have the opportunity to hear directly from the book's author and about the work. And this year we heard from Thea Obrecht about her debut novel, The Tiger's Wife. Set in a Balkan country, The Tiger's Wife traces the stories of 3 generations of a family impacted by conflict in the region. One of the achievements of this book is its ability to trace a history by exploring its aftermath and to gain a deeper understanding of a place and a culture through the stories it tells and passes on. To a certain extent, that is what we can do here, finding our grounding, our imperative, our call to understanding, action, and justice through discussion of the conflict's aftermath and our understanding of its road, its story of reconciliation. While we meet here 20 years after the conflict and some 4,700 miles away, we do so in solidarity with the people of Sarajevo. We do so in the same spirit that has characterized the International Prayer for Peace since 1986, when Pope John Paul asked those at the Assisi World Day of Prayer to keep spreading the message of peace. The values that guide the work of the community of Sant'Egidio resonate deeply with our community here at Georgetown. In fact, we had the privilege of hosting the International Prayer for Peace in 2006. Set up a big platform on the front of campus. A lot of breakout sessions took place right in this room, and in violation of multiple fire codes, we had people from the rafters attending some of the talks that took place during what was an extraordinary moment for the life of our community here at Georgetown. As a community, we are committed to interreligious understanding, to serving our communities and our world, committed to serving justice. At Georgetown, our community is animated by our Catholic and Jesuit tradition, and one of the most influential figures in the modern history of our tradition was Father Pedro Arrupe. In the years at the conclusion of the Second Vatican Council, at a time right when Sant'Egidio was being founded, a time of great social change in our world and in our church, Father Arrupe served as Superior General of the Society of Jesus, a role that he served in from 1966 to 1983. And during those years, in a series of extraordinary essays and speeches, he challenged all of those who live their lives within the context of Jesuit institutions to repudiate both socioeconomic conditions and the sinful structures that sustained lives of abject poverty and oppression. He once wrote, "There is an apparent charity that is a mere cloak for injustice when people are given, apart from the law and as if by benevolence, what is their due in justice. In 1975, under Father Arupe's leadership, the 32nd General Congregation of the Society of Jesus also acknowledged that the society was being invited by the Spirit of God to set out on a new direction. The overriding purpose of the Society of Jesus, namely the service of faith, must also include the promotion of justice. This calling, this challenge to us has helped inform the way we think about justice and global engagement here at the university. We are committed to responding to this challenge. We believe that in order to do this, we must ask tough questions of ourselves and of each other. We must try to understand the root causes of injustice and the structures that perpetuate them. And we must better understand each other. Through dialogue like the one we're having today, through scholarship, and through collaboration and prayer with our faith communities, we can move forward together toward our shared goal of understanding, of reconciliation, and of peace. So it's a privilege for Georgetown to participate in this year's International Prayer for Peace in this unique way. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I too look forward with you to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for coming out. I think the fact that we have such a large crowd is testimony to the importance of these issues, also curiosity perhaps on the part of many of you about what is happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What signs of hope are there? What obstacles are there to further reconciliation? So we want to do a couple of things, as I said at the outset, to go back to understand what happened, the causes or the nature of the conflict, and then to look at some of the efforts, particularly involving interreligious understanding and peace building to improve things in the region. And we've got 4 panelists who can provide different perspectives on these wider themes, and I want to introduce them in order right now. To my far right, you already heard President DeGioia acknowledge Professor Andrea Bartoli, who's the representative of the community of Sant'Egidio here in the United States, and will provide some background on the prayer for peace and the community's work in that part of the world. In addition to his role with the community, Andrea serves as the Dean of the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution across town here at George Mason University, where he specializes in peacemaking and genocide prevention as top themes. Among his publications, he's co-editor of Somalia, Rwanda, and Beyond, the Role of International Media in Wars and International Crisis. To my immediate right, we will then turn to Nida Galazis, a senior associate for European Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, also here in DC. And she'll provide us with an overview of the conflict and its aftermath with a focus on the international dimensions, which continue to be so salient. Nida is an expert on democracy, human rights, and international law, and much of her work centers on East and Southeast Europe. A couple of her publications, one is Cities After the Fall of Communism, Reshaping Cultural Landscapes and European Identity, which she co-edited, and a report very close to our topic this afternoon, entitled The 10th Anniversary of the Dayton Accords and Afterwards, Reflections on Post-Conflict State and Nation Building. We'll then hear to my left from Imam Sabahuddin Sheman, who will relate his experience during the war and his perspective on reconciliation and peace-building efforts to date. A native of Bosnia and Herzegovina who studied in Sarajevo, Imam Sheman now serves as head imam of the Islamic Association of Bosniaks in North America. He's also imam of the Islamic Center of North Phoenix in Arizona, where he resides, and he holds a master's degree in Islamic theology from the Graduate Theological Foundation. Finally, to my far left, we'll hear from Marianne Cusimano Love, who will address the role of religious peace building in the region with a focus on the role of women. Marianne is also a colleague from the area, an associate professor of politics at the Catholic University of America across town, and an expert on international security and peace building. I'll just mention a couple of her publications, Beyond Sovereignty, Issues for a Global Agenda, and the forthcoming Morality Matters, Ethics and the War on Terrorism. So there you have it, a range of different perspectives. like you, I look forward to a fascinating discussion, and I'd like to turn to Andrea to get us started.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I am very happy to be back. It's a wonderful way to be in Sarajevo, even though we are here. I'm delighted to speak as a representative of the community of Sant'Egidio, and I want to thank Claudio and Paola for this privilege in many ways. This is a family of friends trying to live the gospel, and this is the community that is organizing the International Prayer for Peace in Sarajevo. The theme is Living Together is the Future, Religions and Culture in Dialogue. The encounter is organized with the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Catholic Archdiocese of Sarajevo, and the Jewish community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is a highly unusual gathering, we were speaking about it before, that links Sarajevo and Washington through Assisi. Yes, we are meeting here in the spirit of Assisi, sharing in a series of occasions like pearls on a necklace, form a beautiful whole. Yesterday, Catherine Marshall of Georgetown chaired the inaugural session of the event with President Izbegovic. It was a moving moment when presence was grounded in hospitality and words were shared in hope. Thanks to the community of Sant'Egidio, the spirit of Assisi has been moving from town to town, year after year, since 1986. It moves as a gathering of friends, of dreamers, workers of a possible coexistence, and dedicated seeker of the mystery of life. This work is in response to a dream of an old pope. Today in Sarajevo, that dream becomes slightly truer, stronger. Pope John Paul the Great called religious leaders of all denominations and traditions to come to Assisi for an international prayer for peace more than 25 years ago. It was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the fall of communist regime in Soviet Union and neighboring countries, before the peace in Mozambique, of which we celebrate the 20th anniversary this year, before the end of the millennium. For many students here, this was before you were born, long time ago. But for many of us who've been around in this moment, the transformation is just extraordinary. And we have an intense perception of how unusual that invitation was, how unprecedented that invitation was. Roman Catholic popes had protected cities and countries with a powerless presence like Leo or Gregory before them. But they also led armies and crusades. Each pope is different, and John Paul was keenly aware of being the pope after Vatican II, after the council. He revered good Pope John, who had called the Concilium Vaticanum Secundum and had led the Catholic Church in a period of extraordinary renewal. Pope John Paul was also a son of Poland, a mystic, who discovered in his own life that history is not only studied in school, sometimes with wonderful professors like Tom, but as something of the past, but is made of human choices, open to the Spirit. Pope John Paul served the truth of an unfolding history of human flourishing, made of respect, welcome, charity, and mercy. He was a hopeful pope who was able to move beyond the status quo. He had a vision of the earth that was coming, the one of which Teilhard de Chardin spoke eloquently in the words here at Georgetown International Building. The age of nations is past. It remains for us now, if we do not wish to perish, to set aside the ancient prejudice and build the earth. The meeting in Assisi was Pope John Paul's dream, becoming a moment, an actual historical gathering with Christian leaders of all denominations, with Jews and Muslims, Hindu and Buddhist, Zoroastrian and Shinto. It was the first time. Nothing like it ever happened before. Yet in a strange way, it was simply inviting us to see something that had happened every day. People of different tradition praying in their own own ways for peace. Peace, pace, shalom, salam, irene, are not words extraneous to the religious tradition. They are used all the time in prayers. But it is somehow unusual to see and hear and welcome them as they are said by others, willfully, intentionally, respectfully. So what happened in Assisi in 86 was a simple moment of silence, preceded by the prayers in different locations according to different tradition. There was no syncretism, there was no confusion, only mutual recognition and hospitality. That day was an invitation for everyday life of all believers and non-believers. That attitude of mutual recognition and hospitality is indeed terribly needed in so many areas of the world. In Assisi, there was a new beginning, a new possibility springing forth in the mutual recognition and hospitality. The Community of Sant'Egidio participated in that moment and moved with that spirit, organizing the International Prayer for Peace each year. In 2006, that pilgrimage led us here to Georgetown. Pope John Paul did a second prayer for peace in Assisi, this time after September 11. He wanted to pray in particular for this country and for all the countries involved in that horror. He begged for peace as a pilgrim, with the hurt as his own. Now, more than 10 years later, and 2 costly wars, many deaths and extraordinary sufferings, we are encountering that wisdom again. Pope John Paul wanted to visit another place that experienced war in the heart of Europe, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He asked personally to the representative of the Community of Sant'Egidio to facilitate the journey. Unfortunately, it could not be finalized, but we are grateful today of being able to fulfill later, possibly, that dream of a great Pope, a prayer for peace in Sarajevo. While we are here, visit in your heart this country in Europe. Visit its Muslim, Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish communities. Visit the center of a peace agreement that stopped the war and left so much to do. Let's visit and learn. Yes, we want to learn from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We want to explore further what religious communities can do on the way to peace. In 2001, Dr. Betty was involved in the signing of the agreement in Rome, and that is a testament to this commitment. We have a text that is circulating for that agreement. Speaking about commitment, I cannot but notice that since Jack DeGioia became president of Georgetown, the university has been associated with each edition of the Prayer for Peace, not only when it was here in Washington. Occasionally, not only the president or Catherine Marshall or Tom Banchoff, but also students participated. The Contemplative in Action initiative supported that collaboration, and the course on Catholic peacemaking that emerged from it is now taught 3 times a year and is always oversubscribed. There is a hunger to learn more about peace. There is a hunger to understand more to the coming of peace. There is a hunger to dream dreams of peace for this country and beyond. Some of you may know Christian de Chargé. His final moments with the Trappist monks of Tiberin were described in the movie O God of Man. A Christian martyr of the end of the millennium, Christian was not only a good friend of the Community of Sant'Egidio and a participant in the Prayer for Peace after 86, but he was also a translator. Sant'Egidio doesn't pay anyone, and so you had to ask all sorts of friends, to do things. And Christian was one of those that were translating from Arabic to French, French to Arabic. And as in Sarajevo, the actual public moment is preceded by days of conversations, and we remember them well here in Washington, around the urgent, relevant themes: poverty, prayer, cities, loneliness, migrations. Religious leaders share words, reflections, concerns. To translate them is to listen, is to offer them, is to offer back, is to receive and to give back. Christian de Chargé was a master of doing that in Arabic and French, but also among Muslim and Christians, African and Europeans, Algerians and French. His life was taken violently while he was translating the friendship that never ends, the friendship that is at the core of Assisi, that is the hope of Sarajevo. In his testament, written before being killed in Algeria, he offered the testimony of that friendship. He said, "And you too, my last-minute friend, who will not know what you are doing. Yes, for you too, I say this thank you and God bless you. To commend you to this God in whose face I see yours. And we may find each other, happy good thieves in paradise, if it pleases God, the Father of us both." The spirit of Assisi is blowing this invitation to friendship in the midst and after conflict. This invitation to peace among and within each religious tradition. May the spirit of Assisi, now so strongly present in Sarajevo, speak to us and many. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for that background on the work of the community and the legacy of Assisi, which is the backdrop really for our gathering here today, the simultaneous prayer for peace now unfolding in Sarajevo. We asked Nida to provide some background on what has happened, what is going on in this troubled region of the world, focusing on the international dimensions. And we'll move from there towards some of the domestic interactions on the ground. So Nida?
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here today and an honor to be among such a distinguished panel. The violent dissolution of Yugoslavia was perhaps the last tragedy of the 20th century in Europe, which was, of course, itself a century filled with tragedy and violence. I don't say that to diminish the pain and the suffering of the people who lived and still live in the region that we now call the Western Balkans. Certainly, the pain is particular there in the way that Tolstoy describes unhappy families being unhappy in their own way. But I want to talk about how the international community has reacted to this string of tragedies of the last century and how its reaction to Bosnia and its neighbors fit into that context of a reaction and the buildup of institutions that followed the two world wars, the Holocaust, the Cold War. I'll argue that despite the negative impacts of the crisis that's currently facing the EU, the crisis also offers a glimpse at how the stabilizing features that were put into place over the course of the last half century will provide an architecture on which our best hopes for maintaining peace in Europe and in the Balkans is alive today. Over the course of the last century in Europe, the mournful slogan, "Never Again," has forced states to create an international community in order to address the legacy of war and genocide. The international community created institutions that set up systems of values and norms for how states ought to behave, and set up a space in which violations of those norms and conflicts between two or more of those members can be resolved without violence. Today, transatlantic institutions such as NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the Council of Europe can sometimes seem anachronistic after the end of the Cold War. Why do we still need these institutions? Or they also seem to us like an indecipherable alphabet soup. But despite the apparent problems with the EU, for instance, its inability to act 20 years ago when Yugoslavia fell apart, and of course today's Euro crisis, it's nevertheless, we have to remember that it stands as at the frontier of international cooperation, showing the way for how other regions and other countries can end violent conflict and forge cooperation and interdependence. These institutions persist because they have been successful in preventing war, and by insisting that states are governed democratically, and second, by creating supranational institutional structures that bind the countries together. So in many ways, the European Union and its sister institutions in Europe have ended extreme economic resource competition, which brought all the states of the EU to the negotiating table. It built a legal framework that would enable interstate cooperation and coordination and constrain states' ability from simply walking away from agreements when national interests conflict with the agreements they'd made before. It provides a legal framework that was based on a declaration of shared values, the values of peace, of democracy, of human rights, prosperity, social justice, equality, non-discrimination, protection of minorities, and all of the other things that we hear all the time in the rhetoric of these institutions. The values, we have to remember, aren't based on a single religion or a single nation, but are in an aggregate of all of those influences, all the languages, all the countries that make up Europe today. And in that sense, they're meant to be universalized. They're meant to reflect humanist aspirations. These institutions and treaties would help create a new European identity associated with high standards of living, Enlightenment thinking, capitalism, peace, cosmopolitanism, and will eventually lead, has eventually led to greater political integration as well. And essentially, each member state's energies have been diverted since the wars from engaging in zero-sum competition with their neighbors and instead investing into institutions that would enable them to communicate and to coordinate with each other in specific sectors such as energy, national resource management, manufacturing, agriculture, and many others. So it's no surprise that today the driver for both American and European policy towards the Western Balkans is integration of these states into European institutions, and especially the European Union and NATO. Often I hear from people in the Western Balkans that EU accession will not work. It won't work until the tensions and the hatred and the conflict between the ethnic groups is resolved and overcome. They say, first, the international community needs to resolve these conflicts, and then you can talk to us about budget oversight, waste management, tariffs, tax collection, and all of the minutiae, the seeming minutiae of the acquis communautaire and the EU integration policy. But I suggest that we need to do in the Western Balkans what was done between Germany and France. Today, the EU and the US are working together towards a policy in the Western Balkans based on three assumptions. The first is that peace and stability in the Western Balkans can only be achieved by shifting domestic politics away from ethno-nationalist ambitions and towards building open democratic institutions that serve the interests of the citizens. And will allow the country to actively participate in European institutions. Second, it's the process of becoming a member of the European Union and NATO that is transformative. It isn't just being a member, but actually the process of engaging with your once enemy to develop institutions, to create laws, to help build a society, and to help build a government that will serve that society. That's actually, it's the process and not just the goal. And the third assumption is that it's going to be much more difficult in the Western Balkans than it was in previous accessions. And that last point, that enlargement will be more difficult in Bosnia and its neighbors, is what led me to work at the Wilson Center in creating a working group on the Western Balkans. Over the last 2 years, this working group brought together European and American policymakers to strengthen their cooperation on the Balkans. And in a Wilson Center tradition, we brought in academics into the conversation to share their innovative ideas and observations of international policy towards the region, to give us an idea through the working papers of how to better match the challenges in the region with the EU's tools that it has and the inability to cooperate, build cooperation between the EU and the US in the region, in the policy towards the region. The working group was necessary because over time, as the EU developed, the US has not really paid that much attention to how these institutions work, the new complexity of the laws, and how, and this actually has threatened the transatlantic alliance. So in a way, the Western Balkans is bringing the EU and the Americans closer together. Since they share a very strong commitment to building peace in the Western Balkans, it has forced them to reassess their relationship and to find new ways of cooperating. And I've personally witnessed that cooperation grow stronger in the last 4 years that I've worked on this issue. The transatlantic partners have significant resources to apply to the Western Balkans, despite the many challenges that the region presents. And the difficulty of achieving consensus and policy coordination among these many international actors has impeded their progress in the region, and the region has suffered from the slow adaptation of reforms and the incomplete democratic consolidation there. Nevertheless, the working group has created a whole series of policy briefs that hopefully will help guide not only the leaders of the Western Balkans and the international community to forge cooperative structures that will lead the region out of its current state, but also engage the civil society and religious organizations to participate in that process. It often seems like something is happening at 30,000 feet above you, but I think the message that I'm hoping to give is that the international community, the policy actors that I've been working with, the academics that study the region, are uniquely concerned, or primarily concerned with the well-being of the people who have suffered in the region, and in bringing them into the discussion and making sure that governments that we are trying to help build will serve those people. So I'll conclude by saying that, of course, the current EU crisis is frightening, and many observers have focused on the divisive effects of the crisis. But I would argue that it also illustrates clearly that no country in the EU is insulated any longer from the problems that fall on the other, and that there is no easy way to cut off one state from its neighbors. The rhetoric has been that people have been proposing to kick countries out of the Eurozone, to end bailouts, to impose austerity, to create different classes of EU membership. But these and other measures have all been discussed, but also put to the side, because they don't provide there's no simple solution to this problem. Therefore, although the EU is currently tempted towards fragmentation, its leaders seem to understand for now that it's never optimal, it's never an optimal outcome to fragment, and hopefully that will be passed on to the Western Balkans as well. And it's in that spirit that the international community approaches the Western Balkans. The legacy of war and genocide will be difficult to overcome. Yet we must challenge ourselves to remember the positive legacies of cooperation and compromise that also prevail throughout the history of the region. Andrea mentioned that history is made up of human choices, and it's also a human choice to choose which history we look at, and from which experience in the past we can find some hope for building a future together. I think it's there that we'll find the templates to forge new cooperative structures, strong institutions that create a safe space in which to resolve conflicts, and hope to bring Bosnia and its neighbors into the modern, sometimes dysfunctional, European family of nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Nida. Now we're going to hear from Saba Houdin, who is himself, as you heard, a native of the region and can give us a perspective of a participant in many of the events that we've been alluding to, not just the international dimension, but the on-the-ground dimension. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon to all of you. It is my pleasure to be here, and specifically being able to listen and understand that there is an effort, international effort, and at large in the world, to understand and hopefully to bring the Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region into living together as it has been for the centuries ago. Bosnia and Herzegovina was and still is a country with different ethnical, religious, cultural backgrounds. And in that, we can even take the pride. If we can compare, we can say that Sarajevo is a Jerusalem of the Europe. Because in the city of Sarajevo, we have in a less than 500 yards radius, we have a church, we have a synagogue, we have a mosque. As a matter of fact, the mosque and synagogue, they share the same front yard. So the life of coexistence in Bosnia and Herzegovina has been embedded in the history of the Bosnia and Herzegovina. This year was 500th anniversary of coexistence between Muslims and Jews in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So when we talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region, there are, from the history, so many positive things to be said, so many positive examples. But at the same time, in the history of the Bosnia and Herzegovina, in older, newer, newest history, it had been so much suffering. It had been so many casualties. And it seems in this world that we live in nowadays, there is more and more wars. There is more and more injustice, less kindness, less compassion, less mutual understanding, less friendship. I, as a young person, experienced this newest war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a young person who had friends that they are different ethnical background, that they are different religious beliefs. In 1992, I have been simply taken from the home into the concentration camp with the rest of the men, regardless of their age, whether it be children or older people. In the concentration camp, have been tortured as many others. By the will of God, I am the one who survived that experience. I will mention some of the things that, not with the intention to make you feel sorry or feel pity for me or any of those who experienced that, but just to mention that, or that you can see that there is an injustice that has been done to many people. My father was also taken to concentration camp, and after that he was simply executed and thrown in the mass grave, where 6 years after, in 1998, we find his body with the rest of our other 157 people. All my immediate and extended family went through the concentration camp. Women in my immediate and extended family were raped, were tortured. So this is the experience that I personally carry from the war that was happening between 1992 and 1995. It would be easy if this is only my experience, but there are so many more people who share the same experiences as I do. There's many people that have been killed. There's many people that have been displaced throughout the world. As an example, even United States, and we are thankful that we had opportunity to come and live in the United States. There is about over 300,000 Bosniaks that they find refuge in the United States and start establishing the life in this country. As a result of that, we have 58 Bosnian communities throughout the cities in the United States and in Canada. And all of that is in an effort to overcome the experiences that people had. I do not hold any hatred or that I have any wish for retribution in my heart, because this is not the way to live. Because as a person of the faith, I believe that holding the hatred in the heart does not benefit even to the person or to others, and most definitely doesn't benefit to the future generations. From my perspective, Bosnia and Herzegovina now, 20 years after, is having a historical battle. We can say specifically even for the region. And in time, it will show that this is one of our major dilemmas in the world, throughout the world. And that is the dilemma, which will win, living together or separation. And this is a dilemma that many people have. And any effort that civil societies or religious communities can make to promote the life together, it should be done. And this International Prayer Day in Sarajevo, which has a special meaning because it's happening in the Sarajevo, it should be a cause for all of us to seek and look what is the possible way to coexist together and continue to live in a future together. I will mention as a really positive example this international prayer in Sarajevo, where we had attendance of highest authorities of all of our religious communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a great thing. We, as a European people, we have in our mentality. We can call it stubbornness or however, but we have a hard time saying sorry and thank you. This is the biggest difference that I felt as living in this country. That politeness, that need to say thank you if someone does something good to you, or need to say sorry if you did something. In European history, we have a hard time with those words. And for living together in coexistence, those words has to be said and used more often than we do. In all Abrahamic faiths, which are presented in the Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Islam itself, which the word of Islam is meaning peace, and in Islamic teachings, the basic right of peace and justice for all people is asserted in a core of our belief, and I believe of all other faith traditions. And I would say that the justice and peace is like two wings of a bird. We cannot fly with one wing only. We have to have both so that we can fly. There is no peace without justice, and there is no justice without peace. And after war, or 20 years now, all of the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region should face, regardless of their ethnic background, regardless of their religious background, all that has happened in the past, and take the responsibility for any action that has been done, whether it be injustice, which is an enormous injustice done among the people, or whether it be the rights of mutual coexistence, the rights of the freedom and dignity that we all deserve. And I believe that in past, from internal perspective, we did not seek that. We were not successful to face the reality of our actions that has been done between 1992 and 1995. I hope that our leaders of religious communities, leaders of our civil societies, will further this peace building with justice and with intention that all of the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region should have equal rights, should have equal opportunities, and should have the hope that what happened in the newest history of Bosnia and Herzegovina will never happen. For that, the justice has to be served. And if justice is served, then we have hope that we will live in peace, that we will live together as we managed in the centuries in our history. In 2014 will be 100 years since the First World War. That started in Sarajevo also. So Sarajevo has significance, and it should be example of the peace, not the war. Should be example where the people will have security, not the fear and worry. Should be a place from where the coexistence, compassion, kindness, and caring for each other should be implemented. I will be honest, I do not know, is it possible? I do not know how long it could take. But this is what my hopes are, so that future generations don't have the experiences that I had and many other people who went through the similar experiences. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your moving testimony. You've raised a number of themes we'll want to come back to. One of them is the idea of peace building, and Marianne's going to share some thoughts on that topic.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for inviting me to be part of this conversation today. Many of the themes I'll be touching on have been a little bit touched on by others, so I'll be coming at it from a little bit of a different angle. We've heard a bit from Andrea about religious peace building and the prayer for peace with major religious leaders coming together. We've heard from Nita on how the international community wants to engage with civil society, and that process itself is transformative of working with your former enemies. And we've heard very poignantly on the necessity of doing that. when you look at specific circumstances of how the conflict affects families and people. My own work with religious peace building suggests that religious peace building has a face, and it's the face of a woman. My first job at Catholic University, my first semester in 1994-95 school year, was working with Bosniak families, refugee families here in Washington, D.C., through Mary's House, NGO organization, faith-based organization. And it's interesting, kind of the consonance of that with experience with what I'll be talking about today. So religious peace building has a face, and it's a woman's face. Women and girls are disproportionately the victims of violence, whether it's as internally displaced persons, as refugees, or as victims of rape used as a tool of war. We know in Bosnia and Herzegovina, over 1 million fled their homes in the war, disproportionately women and children. The United Nations noted the massive, organized, and systematic detention and rape of women in the Bosnian War. The estimates ranged from 20,000 from the EC's estimates to 50,000 by the Bosnian Ministry of the Interior. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia declared the systematic rape and sexual enslavement constituted crimes against humanity. The good news is, for the first time after this conflict, there was actually prosecution for rape as crimes against humanity. The bad news, of course, is that most women and girls victims of this conflict have not seen assistance, and impunity has been the norm. According to Amnesty International, most have not seen their perpetrators brought to justice or have seen psychological, medical, or social assistance. Successive governments, this is a quote from the Amnesty report, have failed to provide these women with access to adequate health care or psychological support, which is provided only by non-governmental organizations. Over 100,000 internally displaced persons remain, and few international NGOs remain to work with those groups. Additionally, the war led to a thriving trade in human trafficking of women and girls, in which the breakdowns in law and order that came with war were disproportionately borne by that segment of the population, leading Bosnia and Herzegovina to be classified by the U.S. Department of State even 10 years ago as one of the worst countries for human trafficking. Women and girls also are disproportionately adversely affected by war because of the economic repercussions of war. 70% of the bottom billion of the world's poorest population are women and girls. 70% of youth not in school are women and girls. Girls are 3 times more likely to be malnourished. So that's the negative side of the equation, the disproportionate effect that the conflict often has on the female population. But if women are disproportionately victims of violence, women are also the grassroots leaders in peace building. And this is often, I think, an unrecognized component of both peace building and of those of us who look at religious peace building. Whether in caring for refugees, internally displaced persons, whether in caring for victims of rape and sexual violence, or whether in working for reconciliation or work on microfinance, economic development, women's development projects that bring war-torn communities back together. This should not be surprising to us that women religious are women of faith are very, very important in re-knitting societies back together that have been torn apart by violence, particularly in communities where religion has been part of the parameters of that war. Social science and demographics tell us that women are more religious than men by almost any benchmark you look at and almost any study you look at. Whether you measure belief in God, belief in a supreme being, whether you measure attendance at religious services, personal prayer, religious practices, teaching religious values to children, raising a family within a religious tradition, by any of these benchmarks and any of the studies, women consistently rank as more religious than men. These results are so consistent and so accepted within academia across time and across cultures, that the academic debates have tended to be along the lines of why is this finding so pervasive? Is this nature? Is this nurture? But the actual finding has been very well accepted. So because of that, we can understand that religion as one component of violence can more adversely affect women. When churches are bombed, when religious sites are bombed, who are the people worshiping in those religious sites? Who are on the receiving side of that violence? When religious persecution occurs and people are forced to flee, as one of the components of ethnic cleansing, who are the people who are forced to flee? Predominantly women and children. But women are also very strong in their response to these actions, both as advocates, women refugees, advocates for other refugees, women as teachers and healthcare workers who are both reporting the violations and working with victims, women lawyers who are working to take up the cases in international venues. That female face, both as victim and also as the strength and response of peace building, is often not seen. People like the women communities of faith who've been very, very strong in their response to the scourge of human trafficking. I was part in the late 90s of many discussions with the United Nations human trafficking organizations, the United Nations crime organizations, and our conversations were about how to advance the legal status, how to harmonize international law around human trafficking, how to actually implement those laws in countries where trafficking was occurring, and how to ensure that women victims were not penalized, because often it was very difficult for women who were victims of trafficking. They would be turned over to the police as undocumented workers and thrown into jail, while the perpetrators of the crimes went free with impunity. And I'm sorry to report that many in the United Nations, particularly when the conversation was about United Nations peacekeepers or United Nations staff members who themselves were complicit in human trafficking, there was a attitude of boys will be boys. This is, women are the spoils of war. This has been going on for all of humanity. What do you expect me to do about this? So there was kind of a nonchalance. We hear you, but this is a long-going historical trend that far precedes the violence that we were discussing with them about the violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The sisters, God bless them, in religious communities did not take that answer lightly. And they did not take that answer well. That was not the end of the story or the end of the conversation for them. And in coalition with non-governmental organizations and coalition with civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they kept like water to stone on this issue, kept the pressure on governments in Europe and Italy and elsewhere that were receiving countries, on the governments in the region to do better with implementation of laws against human trafficking. And there's a very good news story to report that this past year, the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, now by the US Department of State, is ranked in the first tier of countries that are trying their best to implement laws against human trafficking. And that was the result of the very effective work of women on the ground in these grassroots organizations to keep pressure on governments and to keep the voice of those most affected by conflict at the forefront. That's just one of many examples I could offer. Whether you look at the work of groups like Caritas Internationalis, or Pax Christi, or Catholic Relief Services, that work on the basis of need, not creed. So the work that they do, by definition, is modeling the very sort of interreligious action that we've just heard from our previous speaker as being so necessary to reconstitute communities torn asunder by violence. So I think it's working, but it's often not on the radar screen. So when the international community says, we want to work with civil society, what that often does is bifurcates. I'm currently on the Secretary of State's working group on religion and foreign policy, and we're trying to come up with recommendations for the US government of how the US Department of State and the other organs of US government can better integrate, better cooperate with civil society and with religious actors and factors in foreign policy. And one of my frustrations in this work is that they're very interested in working with women's groups that are secular human rights groups. And then when they say, well, we need to work with religious organizations, then they turn to the male clerical leaders of those religious organizations without even recognizing the vast opportunity to work with women of faith at the grassroots level. So some of the policy recommendations I'm putting forward in that venue, but I would also put forward to you, is the importance of recognizing religious leadership in a more varied way, so that religious leaders at the grassroots level have a female face, and that is a very important and a very powerful tool for peace building on the ground. I think the other thing is to recognize the agency, that women are more than victims, and that what the most successful peace building groups and organizations of faith that do peace building very well, like Jesuit Refugee Services that I've worked with, as well as Caritas and Catholic Relief Services, and many other organizations, take women who have been victims of violence as refugees and raise them up in leadership positions. So they become the program managers, they become the teachers in the refugee camps, they become those who are more than the sum of harms and injustices that have been done to them. And the ability to recognize that human agency in victims of violence and to raise them up to leadership positions, I think is the very great hope of conflict transformation and a new avenue that I think has not been fully exploited or fully understood often by the international community or government. So I'll stop it there so we have time for conversation. But I think that kind of ties together some of the comments we've made by some of the other speakers.
Thanks, Marianne. So maybe before we throw things open for questions from the audience, I just want to link up maybe two of the presentations we just heard, those of Nida and Sabahuddin, and the question of Europe and whether Europe represents a hope. I got from your presentation, Sabahuddin, the sense that progress has been made, but there's still a rich reservoir of mistrust and resentment on all sides that needs to be overcome. And I'm wondering the degree to which you see Europe as an answer in the long term, this embedding of Bosnia and Herzegovina into a deeper set of transnational institutions and the various human rights norms that Nida mentioned as part of this process of reconciliation alongside interreligious dialogue. So that's a question for you. And then maybe, Nida, you can give us an update on what is holding back those negotiations for EU accession. Is it about economics, or is it about some of these human rights issues that we've been discussing? So, okay. Please.
As the perspective or the situation or current situation, it is very hard to give a simple answer. And in many times there are different perspectives or views or how even the issue should be dealt. The religion existed in Europe for a long time, and it's a part of any society. As was mentioned, the secular part of the Europe also has the views on how the whole system and everything should be working. Specifically in Bosnia, we have one issue that maybe it is not mentioned throughout these presentations, and that is the issue of the Bosniaks or the Muslims. As Bosniaks or Bosniak identity, it exists of three aspects, of three segments, and one is the religious, spiritual, one is the national, and one is through the government or through the country. As Bosniaks, we don't have that national identity presented. We are being seen as people, not as a nation. And in many instances, that does not give that right for the place or the country where to live. And I believe in the Bosnia and Herzegovina specific case, why I believe it will be an example for the whole Europe, based on the solving the conditions and the situations in the Bosnia and Herzegovina and the region. It will be an example for the whole Europe how to coexist. The Germany, after World War II, they faced their actions, and after the realization of their own actions, they were able to continue and try to work of being part of the Europe or European Union. As long as we in Bosnia and Herzegovina are pushing or not willing to face what has been done and take the consequences or take the responsibility of all those actions, I don't believe that efforts in reconciliation will be going to the proper direction. As I said, if we don't get to the point that we can say actually sorry, if we don't get to the point that we can sit and discuss and see how the future should be the best with recognition of the past and realization, but not as a way of retribution, but as a way of teaching us how to continue forward in living together and not to come to the position to have the history that we had in the past. In that effort, there is also international perspective. I believe, and this is my personal belief, as a person, even the situation in the Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's also dealt on an international level. There are international stakes that has to be maintained and taken care of. And in that perspective, again, the Bosnia and Herzegovina pays the price of solving and satisfying the whole general conditions in the Europe. How and when, in regards to the economic crisis, in regards to the crisis that they are happening throughout the world and not just the Europe, but I believe that the worst crisis that we can have is moral crisis. And if we overcome our moral crisis, then we will be able to face all the other crises that exist. And we will have a better hope for the future and living together in Europe with prosperity for all the countries and all European Union.
Thank you. Nida, from your perspective? Yeah.
What's holding Bosnia back? I guess I would react to what you said. I mean, there of course is justice is important. Justice is important, to the international community, even if the EU is talking about tax codes and supreme courts and agricultural ministries. This is about creating a justice in a way that, in the sense that justice can be served not only by the ICTY, not only by courts functioning, but also by the fact that you can build a future. There's a justice in the sense that Muslims in Bosnia can create a life and continue living with Croats and Serbs as they had for centuries. There's a justice in that. And I think what the EU is trying to do, and the US is trying to cooperate in that regard, is to help sort out, set up a series of building blocks to get to that step. They're very small steps. They're not sort of justice writ large, but they're tiny steps in the direction in which you can start to rebuild the society. What I think a big holdup in Bosnia is today is that Bosnian leaders are stuck in the Dayton Constitution. They're stuck in the Dayton Accords, which of course was effective in ending the conflict. But the people who helped write the Constitution, the people who helped forge the Dayton Accords, knew that this was only the one beginning step. And that's why I link the Euro crisis. It's a very similar story. The Eurozone was created in the hope that eventually they would build a banking structure that would unify all of them, and oops, they forgot to do that over the last decade, and now there's a bigger crisis. And Bosnia is facing a similar thing. You have to take those little baby steps, even though they don't, that's not going to resolve the horrors that were faced by Bosnian women during the war, but this is sort of a step in that direction. So I guess when I talk about civil society, I hope that civil society will help convince their leaders, the leaders that they elect, to move forward. I think there's a certain comfort that those elected leaders feel in the institutions that the Dayton Constitution has built, and why there's very little incentive for them to sort of move forward. So I would hope that religious groups, women's groups, all the civil society groups would sort of push them along. The power should be there with the electorate to make sure that political leaders are actually serving the interests of the people and not just serving themselves, which I think the international community has been very deeply critical of. And I think that a way forward also is to sort of look at international human rights norms. The Venice Commission has criticized the International Human Rights Court has judged that the Dayton Constitution does not follow human rights norms, and that's sort of the first step in the direction of creating an open, democratic, human rights abiding legal culture that will help Bosnia take another step towards becoming an EU member state, and that's really going to be essential. And keeping the political parties truthful about what they're doing. I think probably better than I do, the big controversy there over the summer is the elected leaders were sort of figuring out a way to ensure that all people had a right to participate in elected office, and not just specific groups. It was clearly discriminatory that neither Jews nor mixed people were able to participate in being elected to political office. And I think the leaders and political parties were involved in trying to renegotiate actually the same deal that they had before, but with a different title, with a different sort of face. So I think this is the role for civil society, for everybody to sort of participate and keep everybody honest, keep the politicians honest. And I think the international norms, the human rights norms, the EU steps towards the EU enlargement help direct all of us towards the same goal.
Thank you. All right, we now have some time for open discussion. I already see a hand here. We have a roving mic. Let's start down here, and then we'll move over here with another question. I ask you to please stand and very briefly introduce yourself and pose a question to one of the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lydia Brown. I'm a sophomore in the college. I'm studying Arabic and psychology. So my question is actually to both, I think your name was Nida and Marian? Marian, yes. Anyway, so my question is, you were speaking a lot about the role of civil society in the European Union in attempting to work with Bosnia to both recover from and move forward and redevelop from what happened during the 1990s, I guess with the eventual goal of becoming an economic and social part of the European Union. And you had mentioned that you were part of the Secretary of State's task force in addressing, I don't know what it was specifically, but it had to do with, I think it was Southeastern Europe, or related. Religion and world affairs, okay. I'm not remembering. But my question is, because we're currently sitting in Washington, D.C., we're at Georgetown University, at the center of the American political landscape, is just if you could share your thoughts on what do you think about the appropriateness of the American government's involvement with grassroots efforts both here, throughout Europe, and specifically in the Bosnia-Herzegovina area, in attempting to contribute toward restorative justice and community building. And not only do you think that this is appropriate, and what is the appropriate level of involvement and collaboration, but also do you think that American involvement and collaboration is actually going to be effective in further developing the road toward peace in Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Thank you. That's a critical angle we had not addressed, the U.S. foreign policy angle. Marianne, could you say a few words to begin? Yeah.
Sure. I think the United States government is involved in peace building around the world, and the question is whether what we do helps or hurts. So I think there's been a lot more attention to conflict-sensitive development in USAID. The problem is, often in large government bureaucracies, the left hand may not know what the right hand is doing. And so the Department of State is focused on peace issues, or USAID is focused on development issues, and those things may not be working together well. So one is to try to harness those things in a more effective manner. But the other part of your question is how to deal with civil society. And you know, the irony here is you have the U.S. society, which has a very vibrant civil society, wanting to encourage civil society abroad, wanting to encourage democratization abroad, but not often having the working parts to figure out how to do that. And that's what the Secretary of State's working group is trying to do, how to better do outreach to civil society abroad, and how to make the U.S. government more able to listen to the voices of civil society as it does foreign policy. So the Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group is one component of that. There's a working group on gender, there's a working group on labor, on human rights, and how to better do outreach with civil society. The good things to report from those efforts, and these, you know, the final action has not yet been taken, is looking at, rather than doing this from Washington-centric, so how can, in Foggy Bottom, we better listen to the voices of nearly 200 countries and millions of civil society groups around the world? How can you better open up U.S. embassies and consulates to have more regularized contact with civil society voices around the world? And I think to build structures to do that is really exciting. But again, making sure that those structures are inclusive of groups like religious groups that are often seen as troublemakers, sources of conflict, or as irrelevant, because, you know, the real work is done by political groups. So, you know, how to negotiate those shoals. We're not irrelevant, but we're not just bomb throwers. You know, how can you look at the more positive contributions that religious civil society groups can make? And that's what the group is trying to do.
Nina? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the appropriateness of U.S. involvement anywhere is, you know, a deeply contentious issue. It may be one of the things that this election, like many others in the past, will hinge upon to some degree. I think the interest in Bosnia, both by Bush administration and the Obama administration most recently, I mean, the Bush administration tried to walk away, but I think everybody is sort of compelled to come back because of the moral dimension. There's a moral dimension to U.S. involvement in Bosnia and in the region that I think is too difficult to surmount or too difficult to ignore. And I think the appropriateness, I think, is also questioned with the idea that any international actor can sort of impose, you know, a justice, an institution, or a constitution on any other state. And I think that's what compels this administration and others to engage with civil society, because if we believe in building a democracy, we need to make sure that those voices are heard, that it isn't just everybody sort of talking over, you know, the people who are primarily involved or the primary beneficiaries of the international aid and assistance. So,
I have a comment,
Please,
if I can, just to add a little observation. One, that Sant'Egidio is an NGO, and that Georgetown is civil society. So in a strange way, you have actors that actually have a curious influence when the future is going to be thought out. And it's interesting for us to notice that the US government can be extremely pragmatic. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the peace in Mozambique. Damian Leader is here. He was a US diplomat working in Rome. And they were listening to a community that had no reason to be listened to. The only reason was the fundamental substance of the political discourse. So I think that the American government is also pragmatic enough to understand that when things are relevant, you can listen to and take the lead.
Thank you. We had a question over here. Yeah.
This work?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm Don Kirsch. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer who was deputy coordinator of the Stability Pact for Southeast Europe in the early 1999 to 2002. I wondered your thoughts and impressions on the role of the Orthodox Church or churches in the region in terms of promoting reconciliation, promoting the notion that one says they're sorry, both at a high level and at a grassroots level. Your observations, and has there been any trend or change over the last 10 years?
I definitely can report from Sarajevo that there is. First of all, the presence of the new patriarch. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's just Irene is an old friend of Sant'Egidio. The expression he used yesterday at the prayer that preceded the opening were extraordinary. we need to kiss every man and woman because they are the image of God. It's definitely a very different perception you have from the Orthodox Church. But I think it's important also to perceive the distances there. In the middle of the conflict, the first visit of a Serbian bishop to Rome organized by Sant'Egido was after 700 years. 700 years, we didn't have any contact. So when we think what happened, the intensity of that exchange, I think it's very important. We were speaking before about this European dimension you were mentioning, but there is something in Sarajevo that is a mirror of European history. Sarajevo becomes Sarajevo because the Jews are expelled from Spain. Sarajevo would not have been this beautiful Jerusalem of Europe if the Jews were still in Spain. They were sent away. And so you can see in a way that what happened in the Balkans is you can read it as this regional crisis, but you can also read it as this Europe coming together to its senses after a century of exclusion and genocide. And so you can read Bosnia as the end of this century of genocide, of this century of exclusion. And I really like your idea of learning, finding justice, finding voice, because I think that you will really be at the core of the new Europe. Either Europe is able to bring Bosnia in, or Europe lost its chance. It will not, in a way, will not be able to exist. It will be a bureaucrat kind of thing. But I really think that there is a challenge that comes from Bosnia to Europe.
One of the reasons for that challenge is exactly the conditions of the religious communities. As Orthodox Church, as a highest authority, Irene, that came, this is such a positive thing that he came, that he was present at this International Prayer Day, and I believe this is the first time, even after the war, that we have our
never happened.
religious authorities being together. So there is a hope that that can be worked. There are obstacles that exist there. There are frustrations even among the regular population, not only toward the religious communities or leaders, even to our civil society. It's felt that it is a frustration that there is no steps forward, even though, as Nida mentioned, that Dayton Accord did not help or is not helping to solve the solution or make those steps. And hopefully we will be able to make those small steps in the future where we will make that giant leap to the living together back again.
Well, I'm tempted to end on that positive note, but I think we should take a couple more questions. Maybe let's gather a couple of questions and make this the final round. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Mary. I'm a new master's student in the MSFS program, and thank you so much, all of you, for being here today. I was very interested in all of your ideas about justice, and I would wonder if somebody would be brave enough to go into more details on how the future of Bosnia, how justice should play a role, because so many countries struggle on what the appropriate level of justice should be. It's because so many victims do need to be compensated for what they've been through. But also, when do you start paying more attention to reconciliation? So if somebody would speak about that, thank you.
Thank you. There was another hand over here in this corner.
Hello. My name is Igor Petrovich. I am a student at Georgetown Law. I am unique in the sense that I was born in Bosnia before the war. I lived there during and after, and then I moved to Ohio, right down the street from Dayton, where the peace accords occurred. My parents are actually, my mother's side is Bosnian Muslim from Sarajevo. My father's side is both Croatian, Serbian Orthodox, Croatian Roman Catholic and Serbian Orthodox. So I'm a little bit of everything.
Very good.
My question is to whoever wants to answer. I would think the Imam, most likely. The international issues are, numerous. We could spend a year talking about them. What I had a question about was the International Criminal Tribunal. as the last estimate, 45 of the people that were found guilty were Serbs, 12 of them were Croats, and 4 of them were Bosniaks. The Serbs and the Croats were found guilty of systematic abuses, while the Bosniaks were found guilty of individual ones. Now, these included military generals and things like that. My question is, and just to add to that, 2.2 million people were displaced from a very small country, and in many cases, these were people that lived there longer than the United States has existed. My question is for the Imam, what hope do you have for the future? All of these things are well-known facts to the people that live there. You know, the perceived focus on Serbian aggression and kind of the more individualistic focus on the Bosnian side of things. And whether that's a valid concern or not, I think is a moot point, because within the community there, it's a valid concern, and it's their belief that that is going on. I like the fact that we have multiple faiths represented here, and I was wondering, you know, how do we move from blaming everybody for everything? Because I think whatever side you're for, quote unquote, there is more than enough blame to pass around to everybody. And how do we move towards actually moving on and actually trying to get the country and the whole region to somewhere where it was before, which is, you know, it was known for other things than just the place where systematic warfare happened.
Thank you. 2 related questions, really, about justice going forward. Would you care to respond? Yeah.
As far as the first part of the question about as justice, I don't see myself as qualified that can lay the path how that should be done. But I can try to answer more to the second part of the question from Igor, who has experience of all the parts of the Bosnia, or all the ethnic backgrounds. I believe that this is the problem that exists exactly, and that it does not allow us to go forward. You mentioned that word blame. And as long as we just push the blame, we will never be able to take responsibility for our own actions. A lot of injustice has been done, regardless of ethnic background. Someone did more, someone did less. I'll paraphrase, Shakespeare said interesting thing. He says, it does not matter what good or evil is, but it matters what man thinks of it. So in this perspective, what matters in that justice, it matters how we perceive it and what we think that is justice. Justice, whoever did any act or any action that was not appropriate action, it should be responsible for his or her actions. And as long as we don't take, instead of looking to blame others, as if we take approach that we take responsibilities for our actions and stand for them and say and judge the actions in the religion, in all religions, and specifically in Islam, we are the ones who have the right to judge the action, good or bad. We don't judge the people, because the people can do some bad. God created us that we are not unmistakable, and many times by the certain action we right away judge the people. We should judge the actions that has been done and make sure that those actions do not repeat itself, regardless from which side is being done, either from Serbs or Croats or Muslims. We have to point it out, and then we have to teach our future generations that those are actions that they are not acceptable actions. And in that manner, we should switch from the blame, we should switch to the affirmative action, where we will all stand together and say that the certain actions that has been done, killing, the rape, or any action that was for our 21st century, as we consider ourselves as educated, advanced people, and we allowed ourselves to do the actions that even the older generations of the people would probably not do. So we need to switch, instead of blame, to point out on the actions that they are not acceptable, regardless to whom they have been done and regardless by whom those actions have been done.
I'd just like to respond quickly with an advertisement for your event next week. So a longer answer to your question about justice versus reconciliation and what does justice mean will be a wonderful discussion by Daniel Philpott on September 14th. Is that right? Berkley Center. Dan Philpott is a colleague of mine from the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, member of Sant'Egidio, has a new book out on just peace in which he really does a wonderful job of walking through these discussions of retributive justice, justice in a legal sense, versus restorative justice, more communally based justice, and what are the ways in which you can negotiate those and communities can negotiate them as they seek reconciliation and sustainable peace. So you want to tell us the time of the, do you remember? It's November 14th, Berkley Center.
It's a lunchtime event, and you can find more information about that event and many other events on our website. Thank you. Thank you, Marianne, for reminding us of that related event. And our time has run out for this more formal part of our discussion. I think we've raised a lot of questions. We haven't really had an opportunity to resolve them. I'm glad that we... Yep.
Can I add 30?
Please.
Just to say that justice is truly, and I'm happy that Jack actually mentioned the Jesuit investment on justice, is really a global challenge. And it's so central to the Muslim experience. The Muslim as a community is the most affected by the injustice. The largest number of victims in the world is Muslim today. And people just don't know it. It's just phenomenally, incredibly unknown. But I do work on genocide prevention, and one thing that I know is that in Rwanda, the most Catholic country in Africa, where we have the genocide, the largest number of people saved, the largest number of rescuers were Muslim. Nobody knows. So there is a justice that comes through the tribunals, but there is a justice that comes in friendship. When John Paul started asking forgiveness, when he started apologizing, he was not looking for a justice of a tribunal. He was looking for a justice that is higher than all of us. The same justice that the two wings that you were speaking before can lead the whole Bosnia and Herzegovina, the whole Europe in a different place. So.
All right, your conclusion was much better than mine. Thank you for seizing the floor, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Andrea, at the end for your invocation of what's going on in Sarajevo and its historical importance. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Washington office of Sant'Egidio, the staffs of the President's office and the Berkley Center, and also ask you to thank our panelists one last time.